Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas has been reportedly invited for an official visit by the King of Saudi Arabia. Arabic media is reporting Abbas already departed for Saudi Arabia Sunday evening. During his visit, he'll be joined by the Minister of Civil Affairs of the Palestinian Authority and the head of the PA's intelligence. On Sunday, the Gulf country hosted a senior delegation of the Hamas terror organization that rules the Gaza Strip. And joining me in studio is I-24 News correspondent Hamda Sanhoud. Hamda, what more can you tell us about this visit taking place?
Sada, good morning. It's still unclear if either of these visits are official. So we do know that Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas was invited by the king for an iftar, a traditional Ramadan meal, and the Hamas delegation was invited by the Saudis to perform a pilgrimage in Mecca. Now, we don't really know when they're arriving. Reports are estimating that both will arrive today on Monday, and if not Monday, sometime before the end of the week, as the Muslim holiday of Eid is on Friday. It's still unclear if the two will meet. Senior Palestinian Authority officials saying that there are no plans at this time for Abbas to meet with Hamas. Let's talk about Hamas for a second and their rift with Saudi Arabia. Since 2007, relations have really been rocky since Hamas took over the Gaza Strip and threw out the Palestinian Authority there. Saudi Arabia even arresting people with Hamas affiliation. But since Hamas has been signaling that they would like a little bit more cooperation with Saudi has been warming up to that as well, releasing some of those prisoners. The Palestinian Authority, this is interesting for them. It's interesting to see if they're going to meet. The last time the two of them met was in Algeria last year, where the two concluded that they would have elections at the end of this year, 2023, but still to be determined.
Is Saudi Arabia taking on a larger role as mediator between the Palestinian factions? And could Saudi Arabia even be a potential mediator between the Israelis and the Palestinians?
Saudi Arabia is putting on a role similar to what Qatar does in these regional conflicts. Remember how Qatar mediated with the Afghanistan withdrawal just a couple of years ago? Saudi Arabia is taking on a similar role in the Middle East, reestablishing their ties with Iran, warming up their ties with Syria, trying to take on a role to show the West that the Middle Eastern countries are going to be in charge of the Middle East. They're trying to create a new world order here to show that they have power and that they are the ones who are going to control the narrative in this part of the world.
Absolutely. It's been a very eventful past few weeks for Middle Eastern geopolitics. Saudi Arabia resuming ties with Iran, attempting to put an end to the war in Yemen. But how concerning is this visit for Israel?
It's very concerning for Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu ran, part of his campaign was that he would try and put Saudi Arabia as one of the signatories of the Abraham Accords. But we've been seeing that Saudi Arabia is not very interested in that, given the escalating security situation in this country, given the incursions by Jewish worshippers to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the continuous raids within the West Bank. Israel should be concerned about what's going on. The Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, speaking, saying that Iran is actually trying to start a war of attrition with Israel based on how they're now warming up with Saudi Arabia and all of these ties. And to your question earlier, could Saudi Arabia be a mediator within the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? The answer right now is no, because Saudi Arabia has no interest in normalizing with Israel at this time. They had a common interest, which was the Iranian threat, but now there's an open channel of dialogue between the Iranians and the Saudis, so they don't need Israel for that anymore.
Thank you very much for that breakdown.
According to the latest news reported by Haaretz, in light of the American efforts to bring Israel and Saudi Arabia closer together, the Saudi embassy in Washington, D.C. has made it clear that an agreement normalizing diplomatic relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia would only be possible if a solution is reached for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Fahad Nazer, the spokesman for the Saudi embassy in Washington, D.C., said in an interview with the English-speaking state-owned Arab News channel in Saudi Arabia, quote, Israel has a lot of potential. Normalization can do wonders. Trade, cultural exchanges. But for that to happen, for the kingdom to take that step, we need the core dispute with the Palestinians to be resolved, end quote. Saudi embassy in Washington is one of the most closed to the media, and interviews such as the one Nazer gave on Sunday to Arab News are quite rare. Nazer also spoke about the rapprochement efforts between Saudi Arabia and Iran during the interview and said not all the disagreements between the two countries have been solved. Most of the interview was about U.S. Saudi relations, which Nazer described as strong and stable, while also emphasizing the recent visits to the kingdom by a long list of senior Biden administration officials. As for Israel, Nazer will also say, quote, Saudi Arabia's position on the Israeli-Palestine conflict has been clear and consistent for many years. It was the late King Abdullah who in 2002 introduced the Arab Peace Initiative. The proposal offers Israel normalization with all members of the Arab states in return for just a comprehensive peace deal with the Palestinians based on a two-state solution. He also went on to say that offer remains on the table. We hope they go back to the negotiating table to try and resolve this dispute, which has brought much pain and suffering across the region. It has been exploited by some of the most extreme elements in the region. These terrorist groups have paid lip service for years, referring to such groups as ISIS and Hezbollah, end quote. Last week, Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud also said, quote, we believe that normalization in the interest of the region, that it would bring significant benefits to all, but without finding a pathway to peace for the Palestinian people, without addressing that challenge, any normalization will have limited benefits, end quote. He also went on to say that in order to continue to focus on advancing the two-state solution, they also need to focus on repairing relations with the Arab world. As for the link between the Palestinian issue and the normalization of relations with Israel, bin Farhan would later say to Arab News, quote, I think the United States has a similar view that it's important to continue on those efforts, end quote. Now, last week, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited Saudi Arabia and met with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and the two discussed the efforts for normalization with Israel. And in a speech to the pro-Israel lobby, AIPAC, in Washington before his trip, Blinken emphasized that an Israeli-Saudi agreement cannot come at the expense of progress between Israel and the Palestinians. Understanding Saudi Arabia's commitment to the Palestinians, Israeli officials said recently that the main obstacle to normalization with the Saudis stems from the latter's demands from the United States to support their development of a civil nuclear program. The recent Saudi statements, alongside Blinken's claims, may suggest that there is a significant gap between the Israelis' right-wing government and the Saudi leadership, also regarding the Palestinian issue. As part of the efforts to advance the normalization, senior Israeli officials told several media outlets last month that they believe that Saudi Arabia will permit direct flights from Israel in June for Arab citizens who make the pilgrimage to Mecca during the Hajj season. However, most of the pilgrims traveling from Israel are scheduled to leave for Saudi Arabia in the coming days and have already purchased flight or transit tickets to travel through Jordan, which reduces the likelihood that the direct flights will be relevant this year, end quote. And that is the latest news. Now my thoughts. You know, Ahmed Melhern, who is a Palestinian journalist and photographer based in Ramallah, went on to say that the Palestinian Authority is witnessing one of the worst financial crises as it could find, and it's safe, unable to fulfill their obligations toward the Palestinians. And Melhern would write that there is no light at the end of the tunnel. And he also went on to say that there are many reasons behind the current crisis, and chief among them are the local economic repercussions of the coronavirus pandemic that led to a decline in domestic revenues collected by the Palestinian Authority. And prior to that, the United States aid to the Palestinian Authority was halted due to the Palestinian Authority's rejection of the U.S. president's peace plan in the Middle East, which was also known as the deal of the century. Also, the Palestinian Authority stopped accepting clearance funds collected by Israel since its decision in June to end all agreements signed with Israel. And most recently, there's been a decline in Arab financial grants and aid allocated to the Palestinian state budget. And, you know, when you have these various problems plaguing the Palestinians, as well as a violent reaction come from groups like the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas, who basically are the military for the Palestinians, even though that they're terrorist groups, you can see how this can become a reciprocating problem over the many, many years. And Israel, their government anyway, doesn't want this to end, because what they want is for Israel, is for the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas to exist, because without them, there's no reason to shower phosphorus and overly exert their military to react violently toward the Palestinian enclaves in these cities. And while the Saudis tend to maintain a strongly sympathizing view for the Palestinians, and especially among the older generations, according to Al Jazeera, in an article dated back in April 20th of 2023, it's the Palestinians who view Saudi Arabia unfavorably. And that is due to the rumors that Saudi Arabia was accused of be working with Israel against its people, and the distrust of Saudi officials and its political approaches deemed to be anti-Palestinian. And there's some truth to this, because when you look at the Israeli-Palestinian cause, this is not something that has just been recent. I mean, we're talking about 70 years of internal conflict, and it's been totally one-sided, with Israel, basically the government, using its military and local police to enforce unjust laws that are in direct conflict with laws from the international criminal courts. And when you have human rights groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International calling out the abuses of the Israeli government, you have a major pushback from who? Israeli lobbyists, who are strategically positioned in almost every faction of government around the world, specifically the more powerful coalition governments. And when you have the most powerful first world nation on your side, the United States, it's almost as if you have the big brother, and you could start picking on the little kids for in fear of being a victim of the big brother. And, you know, in the House of Saud, there's a divide over the potential embrace of Israel, in which the current king, King Salman, had even expressed his support for an independent Palestinian state based on the pre-67 borders. And Turkey bin Faisal al-Saud, who is the former head of the General Intelligence Directorate and has close ties to King Salman, he had expressed his support for the independent state based on those pre-67 borders for years. And, you know, recently at a Bahrain security summit that was attended by the Israeli foreign minister, it was Turkey bin Faisal al-Saud who accused Israel of depicting itself as this, as he said, quote, this small existentially threatened country surrounded by bloodthirsty killers who wants to eradicate her from her existence, end quote. Now, I'm not saying that there are Arab terrorist groups or Arab governments that would basically be very aggressive toward Israel if the United States were to suddenly disassociate from Israel. But this paranoia from the Israeli government saying that they're surrounded by enemies is not the case, because for years, none of these Arab countries, especially from the Gulf, like Bahrain or United Arab Emirates, Yemen or Saudi Arabia, none of those countries ever got involved more than as far as going to the media and pleading their crocodile tears for the Palestinian people. None of those countries ever interfered, forcefully interfered on behalf of the Palestinians, even though the Palestinians were begging, literally begging for these Gulf countries to basically help them on behalf. No, instead, the Gulf actually repaired their relations with Israel and said to them the only way for hegemony with the Arab countries is to address the Palestinian issue. Guess where I heard that from? King Fahd during the 1980s, King Faisal in the 1970s. I could go further and further. None of these kings, they're all frauds, right? These people only care about the Palestinians when it becomes a threat to their relations with countries like Israel in the future. And as I read to you the latest news from Haaretz, that's exactly what's happening. And so, listen, as long as the Gulf countries and as long as the Arab world and countries like Syria and Jordan and Egypt, they're not innocent either, as long as they don't do anything on behalf of the Palestinian people, well, then Israel will continue, the Israeli government will continue to abuse the civil liberties of Palestinians, which are their own countrymen. They will continue to steal land in favor of Israeli-owned settlement homes. They will continue to mock and ignore the declarations made by human rights groups around the world and the international criminal courts in defiance of suggesting that Israel be a Jewish-owned country. And if that's the case, well, then the future of the Palestinians are doomed unless the United States finally realizes that a partnership with Israel is a failure on its own merits, because if the Israelis are willing to do that to their own countrymen, what else are they willing to do to people that are not?